The European Union, America's largest trading partner, awaits word on whether President Trump will impose harsh tariffs on European goods. The president already slapped a 20% import tax on EU products back in April, but paused the move until July the 9th to allow for talks. That deadline now looms. Trump has threatened to raise tariffs even further, up to 50% if negotiations fail. Such a hike would make European products like French cheese, German electronics and Spanish medicines much more expensive for American consumers. The EU says it still wants a deal, but is ready to retaliate, promising tariffs on US exports ranging from beef and auto parts to beer and Boeing planes. Well, Dr. Nwandi, thank you for staying with us. Of course, we know that this tariff deadline is upcoming. We know that discussions have been had, but clearly still work needing to be done with many nations in the US, but specifically here, the EU. It is the US's biggest trading partner. Firstly, do you think Trump will actually stick to his word? Because we know there will be an economic impact if tariffs are up to 50% on certain goods coming from the EU. And how quickly do you think a deal could get done given the current impasse at play?
I think Trump is basically heading to look into the tariff element, to hike the tariff. But how significant it will be, or there will be some negotiation, I think this is another subject matter to be discussed. But as long as the trend is showing, Trump is basically not going to step back in his decision of hiking the tariff. And of course, July 9 deadline is significant in looking whether there are some high-level framework elements to be materialized and some elements that might be looking into on how to reduce the severe economic penalties that might be receiving by the EU if this tariff war goes ahead. And I do believe that now we're also looking into the EU is preparing the counter tariff. Euro also basically looking into the targeting the US export in all the sector, that manufacturing, cosmetic machinery, aviations, and other part of that, and to look into some remedies need to be done if the deployments of, if the significant elements of discussion collapse by the talks to reduce or to have some form of formidable better solutions according to the tariff. And of course, the intensifying talks that we have now within the US trades, within the EU parts, and before July, I think there will be a form of significant to look into that. And there'll be some legal and political dimension involved. There'll be some form of injunctions will be held in the context by the EU or the US to hold the tariff or to make sure that it does not exceed the presidential power of the Trump to look into how it could look into form of that. So nevertheless, I think across the US and EU trades, there will be some lots of GDPs losing out. There will be lots of capital losing out, particularly for both countries, particularly on the EU's countries like Israel, countries like Italy, for itself, alone might be risking of losing billions of dollars of tariff due to the lack of elements if this deal fall out. I think this is something that gives a strong considerations of EU. EU basically are looking to what are the responses and delegating the frameworks of discussion to make sure that the negotiation works well and to maintain the 10% baseline tariff, but to prevent the full 50% and more increase, basically modeled by the US-UK agreement, is something that to become a worrying part of EU. And some US leaders are very split on these decisions. Germany basically are pushing back to quick deal to avoid any form of economic fallouts. France looking into much more favour and stronger, more equitable agreements. And all the EU countries basically are moving by individual, by unilateral and bilateral discussing directly with Europe, with US and EU is moving into the multilateral pacts to have some negotiation to make sure that these negotiations and framework deal will be around the baseline of 10% tariff.
Yes, and Dr. Nwandi, we of course talk about tariffs all the time since Trump's Liberation Day in early April. But can you provide some context, please, on what the actual impact will be for individuals that are living in the United States, but also those that are living in the EU and other countries that may not have a deal agreed and see these tariffs jump up from the 10% baseline to potentially up to 50 or 70% in some nations' cases?
I think one of the biggest economic concern is basically the US or the EU's economic facing a pricing of consumer price hikes. So as long as we or the EU people, I mean, around the world impacted by the tariff war between China, US, and EU and US. There'll be a form of hiking of consumer prices might be around 20, 25 more, that around 30 to 50%, subjected to some currency shift. And this also will affect the denominatings of the US dollar against other currencies, yuans, BRICS, and countries, and other form of currencies. And this also look into the whole of the EU and US trade channel of environments of economics. There'll be some, like mentioned earlier, GDP loss and consumer price hike. But the one that matter most, of course, the potentiality of the jobs losing, employment rates across the regions of EU, when the tariff will hike the price and will burdens the elements of the cost, and eventually will make the economics to be collapse. And the other significant element, we're going to see lots of injunctions, lots of tariff war being put by the legal representations on how to block tariff elements and what will be the next elements. There might be a consortiums of legal frameworks across the region to discuss on this, but basically the one that's going to lose more is basically the country's GDP and the job employments, the financial risk, and might be some elements that might be not subjected to real significance impact, that be a form of inflation rate across the EU and some certain countries affected by this global tariff policy war.
Yes, Dr. Nawandi, if you stay with us, we are going to move on now. And